Buenas noches, estimado público, personal de salud, familia, amigos que nos visitan esta noche. Welcome to this talk in Dr. Caprini. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to having you here in Ecuador. Para nosotros, Dr. Gabriel Buitrón, César Briceño, Daniel Arroyo, médicos de varices de Ecuador, es un honor y privilegio contar con la presencia de un prestigioso médico como es el Dr. Joseph Caprini, experto en el manejo y en la prevención del tromboembolismo venoso. Joseph Caprini es un médico emérito por la Universidad de Illinois, es un docente de la Universidad de Chicago, cuenta con más de 750 publicaciones coautor y autor y más de 1,750 charlas que ha dictado. Es miembro de sociedades nacionales e internacionales. La modalidad que nosotros vamos a usar para esta entrevista contiene 4 etapas. La primera a cargo del doctor Briceño, que nos brindará una introducción. La segunda a cargo del doctor Caprini. Tercera y cuarta, que son preguntas del público general y del público específico. Nuestro objetivo en casa es que ustedes puedan familiarizarse con esta enfermedad y usar el score Caprini Friendly, amigable, para que puedan acudir a un hospital y sea de mayor utilidad para los médicos. De igual manera, para el personal de salud, que podamos brindar una prevención y tratamiento adecuado a pacientes con trombosis y coronavirus, que es lo que tenemos en la fecha actual. A continuación, el doctor César Briceño.
Para Varices Ecuador es un privilegio tener a todo este público presente el día de hoy que esté transmitiéndose. Y es un honor tenerlo al doctor Caprini el día de hoy acompañándonos. Por favor, voy a compartir una presentación y una introducción a la escala que vamos a tomar el día de hoy en cuenta. ¿Me confirman si están viendo todos?
Correcto.
La enfermedad tromboembólica venosa abarca 2 patologías, la trombosis venosa profunda y la tromboembolia pulmonar. Es la primera causa prevenible de muerte intrahospitalaria y con mayor comorbilidad asociada a largo plazo. En Ecuador abarca aproximadamente un 5 a 10% de muertes intrahospitalarias y es la tercera causa de muerte cardiovascular después del stroke y del infarto agudo del miocardio. Hay que asociar a esto el gasto sanitario tan elevado que conlleva. En Estados Unidos, aproximadamente 350,000 a 600,000 estadounidenses anualmente sufren de esta patología. Debido a una clínica inespecífica, se requiere un modelo clínico para saber la probabilidad de esta patología y así realizar pruebas objetivas específicas y un tratamiento oportuno y adecuado. Un grupo de médicos, enfermeras y científicos liderados por el Dr. Caprini desarrolló un sistema de calificación de evaluación de riesgos publicados por primera vez en 1991. El score ha sido validado en más de 250,000 pacientes con más de 100 ensayos clínicos. La asignación inicial de puntos se basó en el riesgo relativo de trombosis para cada factor, utilizando la literatura actual en ese momento. A medida que aumenta la puntuación numérica, la tasa de tromboembolismo venoso clínico aumenta exponencialmente. La puntuación total para cada paciente se comparó con la incidencia de los eventos tromboembólicos clínicamente evidentes a los 30 días para poder validar este modelo. El sistema de puntuación Caprini proporciona un método consistente, exhaustivo y eficaz para la estratificación del riesgo y la selección de profilaxis para la prevención de la enfermedad tromboembólica venosa. Esta es la escala que todos conocemos, en la cual el médico es el principal protagonista a la hora de su aplicación. En la versión 2013 es la iteración más reciente de la escala. Esta versión difiere de las versiones anteriores en las que incluyen algunos factores de riesgo adicionales que ya los vamos a mencionar. Entonces conocemos la importancia y la validez de la escala, pero ¿qué hay de su interpretación? Recientemente Panuzzi, en el 2017, evaluó 13 de los estudios más importantes, 14,776 pacientes. Su hallazgo más importante fue que aumentó 14 veces el riesgo de tromboembolia en los pacientes quirúrgicos que no recibieron tromboprofilaxis, pero también demostró que el beneficio de la tromboprofilaxis perioperatoria solo se encontró en los pacientes quirúrgicos que tenían un puntaje de Caprini igual o mayor a 7. El 75% de los pacientes tenía un puntaje de 6 o menos, podrían haberse, entre comillas, evitado la tromboprofilaxis. Demuestra que el valor de la puntuación de Caprini al clasificar el riesgo del paciente para utilizar selectivamente los anticoagulantes sin exponer a toda la población a estos, como era popular en el pasado. En el segundo artículo, profilaxis usando el score de Caprini, centra muchas de las caras de la enfermedad tromboembólica. Es un artículo bastante completo de los escenarios desafiantes en la práctica clínica. Dentro de lo que nos comenta este artículo, múltiples estudios han demostrado que la incidencia de los eventos trombóticos clínicos con pacientes con puntaje menor a 4 eran inferiores al 1%. Estos pacientes de bajo riesgo se libran de una profilaxis anticoagulante después de la operación. En general, estos pacientes tenían una puntuación menor a 5. Hasta el 50% de estos pacientes entraban dentro de esta clasificación. El riesgo estándar, el riesgo conocido como pacientes que se benefician de la anticoagulación, superando la incidencia de los eventos hemorrágicos, tienen una puntuación promedia entre 5 y 8. Estos pacientes requieren de 7 a 10 días de tromboprofilaxis después de la cirugía. Y pacientes con alto riesgo, pacientes que requieren una protección anticoagulante por 30 días, son pacientes con un score más de 8 para cirugía general, más de 10 para el reemplazo total de la articulación y más de 12 después de una fractura de cadera. Así, la Sociedad de Hematología Americana en el 2019, el CHEST, en su 9ª edición, recomiendan el modelo de evaluación de los riesgos de Caprini, así también como las guías escocesas y las guías NICE. De estos grupos, el AT9 define al grupo como alto riesgo con un puntaje mayor a 5 en pacientes sometidos a cirugía general. En el 2017, Fuentes y sus colaboradores probaron varias versiones, en las cuales adaptaron el score de Caprini a una encuesta más amigable para que el paciente la pueda llenar en casa. Tiene una alta correlación con el método estándar. Se requieren de 5 minutos para que el paciente la llene y luego de unos 6 minutos para que el médico integre y finalice la puntuación. Y es que este score tiene algunas ventajas. De las más importantes es que el paciente, cuando está en presencia de miembros de la familia, proporciona detalles más acertados acerca de los antecedentes familiares de trombosis. A la par, se comparó con los datos que no eran tan fiables con el método estándar. También se demostró que el periodo preoperatorio inmediato no es el recomendado para aplicar la encuesta, ya que en el preoperatorio el paciente está estresado, el paciente está ansioso, está preocupado por su cirugía, si va a salir bien o si va a tener alguna complicación. La visita de prueba prequirúrgica pues sería una oportunidad más óptima para realizarlo. Algunos de los factores de riesgo adicionales que mencionamos del 2013 son factores en los que no están validados en estudios, pero que la literatura a lo largo de las explicaciones los han asociado con la trombosis. Dentro de estos son la obesidad mórbida con un índice de masa corporal más de 40, tabaquismo, diabetes insulino requeriente, quimioterapia, transfusiones sanguíneas, VIH y una cirugía que dure más de 2 horas. Como conclusión, ¿qué podemos decir? Que la escala de Caprini es una herramienta dinámica. Requiere una evaluación continua del paciente durante su hospitalización y en la recuperación postoperatoria. Que los cambios en el estado clínico podrían dar lugar a un cambio de la puntuación y por ende a un cambio en el tratamiento ofertado. Y que el sistema de puntuación de Caprini 2013 proporciona un método consistente, preciso, eficaz para la estratificación del riesgo y la selección de la profilaxis. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, a continuación le vamos a una pequeña introducción para el doctor Joseph Caprini y después vamos a continuar con el doctor. Entonces, primero les voy a dar la bienvenida en inglés. So, good evening, doctor. I hope you and your family are doing just fine. First, we would like to thank you for being here with us tonight, sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. Second, I want to thank Dr. Huitrón and Dr. Briceño who make this possible, and they have made an amazing job this week working on it. A little bit of an introduction tonight. Dr. Caprini is a hematologist. He's a clinical senior physician from North Shore University Hospital at Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. He has written more than 700 papers, been in several book chapters, and creator of the Caprini score. So today we're going to be discussing about COVID-19. As we all know, at the beginning, COVID-19 was only treated as a respiratory disease. But nowadays, we know that something is happening in our immune system and in our clothing system. For these reasons, during this lecture, we will be covering some topics. One is cloud information, risk factors, prevention, and clothing treatment. At the end, we will have a Q&A section where I will be translating some of the questions from the answers from the audience for you, doctor. And las personas que deseen hacer preguntas, por favor, pueden hacerlo a través del chat. Las preguntas deben ser lo más cortas y lo más precisas por términos en cuanto de la traducción y todo eso. Traten de hacerlas un poquito más claras. So, doctor, be my guest and you can start your speak.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present these data and to interact with you, and we can learn together. I'm only sorry that we can't do this in person, and I'm especially favored toward people from Ecuador because my new partner, Alfonso Tafur, and his family come from Ecuador, and they've provided a wonderful, they're a wonderful family, and I'm also, Alfonso has made great strides in taking what I have done and starting to take it to the next level. So with that, I would like to start the presentation.
Entonces el doctor nos va a presentar nos va a hacer una presentación de su trabajo en la cual nos va a mostrar a continuación.
Greetings. During the past several months, we've learned a great deal about patients suffering from the coronavirus, including the serious morbidity and mortality associated with the disease. The daunting challenge of saving patients who develop severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus is just one clinical challenge, but the necessity for urgent elective surgery introduces a whole new level of complexity. Here are my disclosures. So, coronavirus and thrombosis, what do we know so far? We realize that the virus-induced inflammation triggers a cytokine storm, causing tissue factor release, thrombin generation, and fibrin formation. And this fibrin is designed to coat the virus and prevent its spread and replication. Now, that's a great mechanism, but it has one unfortunate side effect: thrombosis. The activation of thrombin induces a hypercoagulability that can be measured with a D-dimer and fibrin split products. Deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, stroke, arterial thrombosis, all may occur. But we have to remember that microvascular thrombosis is occurring all over the body and may result in organ insufficiency or failure in the lungs, liver, kidney, or even brain. The fibrinolysis, that is a reaction to the thrombosis on the basis of the body, produces fibrin split products. And a DIC picture can result in thrombosis or bleeding, depending on the consumption of clotting factors and platelets. And these, of course, can be measured by prothrombin time, partial thromboplastin time, platelet count. What are the symptoms? They can be mild and flu-like, or you could have a serious infection with systemic sepsis, organ failure and death. Pneumonia and respiratory failure commonly occur, as well as deep vein thrombosis with swollen, painful legs or arms, eventually leading to the post-thrombotic syndrome if the patient survives the illness. Pulmonary emboli can result in respiratory failure and death, or chronic pulmonary damage down the road after recovery. Stroke with paralysis and death have also been observed. We realize that the presence of additional risk factors compounds the likelihood of a poor outcome in these patients. And this COVID-19 picture mimics, if you will, Virchow's triad. And these are the three factors that are associated with especially venous thrombosis. And stasis, endothelial dysfunction, and coagulopathy are all essential hallmarks of this disease and can result in a variety of problems. One of the things that's important to remember is that venous thromboembolism or arterial thrombosis is seen in nearly 40% of ICU patients compared to only 2 or 3% on the ward. So getting into ICU connotes a serious escalation of the disease, whether or not they actually have to be placed on respirators. Remember that COVID-19 is an endothelial illness involving the systemic vascular tree. And investigators have postulated that the lung environment is prone for local vascular leakage leading to angioedema, as can be seen in this cartoon. They hypothesize that a bradykinin-dependent local lung angioedema via bradykinin receptors is an important feature of COVID-19. Blocking these receptors and inhibiting kallikrein activity are postulated to have an ameliorating effect on early disease and might prevent acute respiratory distress syndrome. In addition, this pathway might indirectly be responsive to anti-inflammatory agents. And in that regard, a number of investigators have employed early and heavy dose corticosteroids to try to blunt this process. Here we see another cartoon which is designed to show the complexity associated with multiple systems activation as a result of the coronavirus problem. Cytokine storm is a key feature of this, and sometimes it's massive and activates platelets and other clotting factors. This can damage the endothelium, and the neutrophils can express tissue factor, which further activates clotting. Neutrophils' extracellular traps can form, and these contain damaged DNA and other products, including histones and chemical mediators, which can together also block and damage the endothelial surface. Reflecting on all of these changes that occur in multiple locations, both in the inflammatory and clotting pathways, one is reminded of the non-anticoagulant effects of heparins and related agents. The polyanionic nature of heparins binds to proteins and is an effective inhibitor of the viral attachment. So looking at all of these various effects, it's obvious that the use of heparin, or low molecular weight heparins, are one of the cornerstones in trying to blunt the side effects of this disease and also block the pathways, both of inflammation, complement and kallikrein, as well as clotting, fibrinolysis, and platelet activation. We know that when surgery is introduced into the picture in the presence of this virus, that the result can be a very, very serious and, if you will, an explosive picture. Let us take a look at the Caprini score, which is a way to evaluate these patients, which I think is a very essential element. And some have said, why bother to do this? Since all of these patients are at high risk, so we need to put them all on heparin. But there's a matter of degree, and there are some very important aspects to be considered. So when we take a look at the Caprini score, it's a thorough history and physical composed of 40 elements. And we know as the number of elements or risk factors goes up, the incidence of DVT increases. We also know that risk factors have different powers to cause a thrombosis. Bed rest, for example, is not as powerful a risk factor as a past history of thrombosis or cancer. So that the power of these risk factors also factors into the equation by combining the power of individual risk factors as well as the number of risk factors, we come up with a score, and that score has been associated in a linear or nonlinear fashion to the incidence of clinical venous thromboembolic events. And here we see a typical pattern in general surgical patients. Now, it's very difficult to collect all this information and especially I've been told by first-line workers is we have these patients coming in. Oftentimes they're very sick. They're an emergent nature. We don't have time to sit down with them and talk about 40 questions. Well, my colleagues in our group have come up with a very important patient-friendly assessment for the disease. And as you know, when you go to the dentist, you have to fill in your health history. And if you're brought to the hospital sick, you're usually brought by the family, and the family can help fill out this form. The form is in multiple languages around the world, and it's in very user-friendly language so that it can be easily completed by the patients. And then finally, once that form is filled out by the patients, then it can be completed by the healthcare provider that's responsible on admission for the history and physical. Now, for surgical patients, it's important to prospectively collect this score. And then in terms of filling it out, we have additional risk factors now that we have the coronavirus. And we score all of those people who are positive with an additional 2 points and add an extra point if the D-dimer is over 2 times normal. Remember, you have to add the surgical procedural risks to that. So the risk of a major colon resection is different than that of a routine appendectomy or a small procedure. The score has to be updated during hospitalization as complications occur. Oftentimes, a patient will come in with a simple problem, let's say an acute appendix, and then post-operatively, the patient will leak, have another procedure, need a central line for antibiotics to be infused, maybe get a pneumonia in addition to that. So the patient becomes from a very low patient to a very high-risk patient. Now let us talk about the surgical procedure, because the surgical procedure is an embodiment of Virchow's triad. And as you know, over 100 years ago, Rudolf Virchow described a triad of factors associated with the development of venous thrombosis. And we know that when the patient is put to sleep, they've given a muscle relaxant in order to intubate the patient, and that causes venous stasis due to calf muscle paralysis. The veins become over-distended because the blood is not flowing out normally, but the arteries are continuing to pump blood in. In addition to that, hypercoagulability occurs not only because of the basic disease and underlying pathology, but also the metabolites of the muscles are being secreted into these dilated venous segments, and there's nowhere for it to go, or the very slow flow out of the leg. And that creates a very sort of witch's brew for producing a thrombosis in these vessels. And that's why it's very, very important to use pneumatic compression during these procedures. And of course, the time of anesthesia and the magnitude of the procedure all contribute to this, if you will, witch's brew. Now, recently we put together some guidelines from the American Venous Forum regarding considerations for prophylaxis and treatment of venous thrombosis. Patients all should be scored on admission and rescored during hospitalization with the Caprini score as we previously described. Baseline blood count, platelet count, prothrombin time, partial thromboplastin time, D-dimer assay, and fibrin split products should be done initially and serially, especially if the patient's developing complications. All patients should receive heparin or low molecular weight heparin. Consider doubling the dose for scores of over 8 or those with multiple risk factors, especially those with a BMI of over 35 or those that have cardiac abnormalities or congestive failure. It's very important to increase the dose under those circumstances. Also, depending on the level of D-dimer elevation and the seriousness of illness of the patient, it may be important to go ahead and escalate that dose of anticoagulation up to a therapeutic level. And this is being done around the country and around the world by multiple investigators. We don't recommend routine ultrasound, but only reserve it for those with specific indications that would change the patient's management, such as a swollen leg, pain, tenderness in the leg that are become extreme, And under these circumstances, then a point of care ultrasound could be done. We advocate that the Caprini score needs to be daily reevaluated along with the labs. And then unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin chosen on the basis of clinical situation, including the bleeding risk in those patients that have organ insufficiency. Sometimes they'll do much better with unfractionated heparin than reduced doses of low molecular weight heparin. Although the Wells score can be used to predict VTE, it does not account for all the comorbidities, but it may be useful to guide therapeutic anticoagulation or duplex scanning under certain clinical circumstances. Post-discharge prophylaxis is absolutely critical. Now let us take a look at several recent cases that my partners have experienced regarding this disease. The first is a 90-year-old male who had a non-healing but very painful foot ulcer with an ankle brachial index of 0.3 and a toe pressure of 20 millimeters. The patient was coronavirus negative. An angiogram was done to see if a non-surgical intervention would be appropriate, and it wasn't. So the patient had to undergo a femoral popliteal bypass, which was successful. 40 milligrams of low molecular weight heparin twice a day was used postoperatively, including not only the hospitalization, but following discharge to an extended care 10 days later. So approximately several weeks after the patient's surgery, the patient was readmitted with coronavirus positive, and this was attributed to a healthcare worker at the extended care facility. And the patient needed to be put on a respirator, was given full dose low molecular weight heparin, but to no avail, and died 48 hours later. An autopsy was done and found that the graft was patent. There was no arterial occlusion, and there was no venous thromboembolic event either, but there was. The next patient was a 57-year-old male who had insulin-dependent diabetes, a BMI of 40, hypertension, sleep apnea, and he was a maintenance manager at a nursing home and contracted the virus. He presented with a 3 times normal D-dimer, and the left leg was very dusky from the knee to the foot. Full anticoagulation with low molecular weight heparin was administered, as well as fibrinolytic therapy in 2 courses. A palpable pulse in the groin and popliteal was documented after the fibrinolytic treatment, and this tended to improve during the week of hospitalization with the low molecular weight heparin. Unfortunately, below the knee had become ischemic and gangrenous, and a below knee amputation was done in this patient in the negative pressure OR. At the end of the procedure, the physician dissected the specimen in the OR that was removed. It wasn't sent to pathology, avoiding any additional transfer of the virus. And thrombosis of all 3 tibial arteries was noted, but the veins were patent. The patient was recovering slowly and the stump healed, but the patient has remained in the hospital as of this writing due to a bacterial pneumonia. So we understand that surgical procedures in COVID-19 patients are very serious, and not only because of the nature of the disease with all the thrombotic elements, but in addition to that, all the risk factors that the patients bring to the table. And as a result of that, an increased incidence of arterial thrombosis, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary emboli, stroke, or fatal thromboembolic events require careful risk assessment and appropriate thrombosis prophylaxis for the at-risk period, especially following discharge. Now, here is an expression given to me by a Maine friend who was a well-known dentist. And it's never kill a friend, never treat a stranger. Now, what's going on here? What did he mean by that? Well, what he meant was that it's important to perform a thorough history and physical to every patient you meet, so that gives you knowledge about this patient that's the same as your knowledge would be, or even more than a good friend. So, of course, you would never treat a stranger, and you would never hurt a friend. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I would encourage you, all of you, to visit my website at venusdisease.com for more information, and have a wonderful day and stay safe. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for listening to that. And I have an update that I would like to show you. I'll have to bring it up on the computer, but we've changed the Caprini score since this video was created, and it now we have changed it so that patients that have coronavirus that are asymptomatic get 2 points, and patients that are symptomatic get an additional point, and then patients that are COVID positive and have a D-dimer elevated get 5 points. And I'd like to bring that up on the screen here.
Ok, en este momento el doctor nos está hablando que vamos a tener una actualización de la escala de Caprini en relación a pacientes que sean COVID que sean asintomáticos, pacientes COVID que sean sintomáticos y pacientes COVID que sean sintomáticos y presenten un dímero D elevado. Okay, doctor, so go ahead and keep.
No, what I would encourage you to do is to start scoring these patients and see in return for me sharing everything with you, you could help me by trying to prospectively take a look at this scoring system and see how it correlates with outcomes as we go forward. And you have to make sure that you ask all of the questions, and especially history and family history of thrombosis, and make sure that you follow the guidelines of the ambulation and others things that we have. I noticed that you referenced Ivor Galimi, and Alfonso Tafur and I wrote a Disease of the Month monograph, and that has all the information in it explaining the various risk factors. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for your attention, and I'll be happy to try to address any questions.
Entonces el doctor, bueno, nos insiste en que la evaluación tanto pre-hospitalaria como intrahospitalaria se debe hacer de una manera bastante minuciosa con el fin de determinar realmente, estratificar al paciente que tenga TBP o posiblemente pueda desarrollar TBP. Entonces nos realiza una manera que nos esforcemos un poco más en determinar este tipo de estratificación. Y a continuación, pues el doctor nos permitirá realizar algunas preguntas y respuestas en relación al tema de cualquier duda que tengan cualquiera de los participantes. Bueno, vamos a empezar con las preguntas generales. La primera pregunta que teníamos que nos habían dejado es que, conociendo que los factores de riesgo para tromboembolismo venoso son estar de pie, sentado por periodos prolongados, la edad, comorbilidades de los pacientes, que tengan un índice de masa corporal muy elevado, estar encamados, sin que en esta época que hemos pasado en cuarentena por más de 2 meses, si considera usted que los factores de riesgo han empeorado. Dr. Caprini, in Ecuador, we are more than 2 months in quarantine. Do you think people's risk factors get worse during this period?
Yes, that's a very important consideration, and that is that quarantining people and having them not have their normal activities can place them at increased risk. So I think it's very important that, first of all, every one of these patients really needs to do their own risk assessment and see what their score is. And then they need to modify as much as possible modifiable risk factors, wearing stockings, going out and exercising. And if they have trouble or the weather is bad, walk around the house, walk up and down the stairs, try to get some exercise every single day and try to stay active. And for those patients that, are in a situation where a family member has come in and the family member is positive, then that's very important that they get tested. And if they're positive, even though they're outpatients and they're asymptomatic, if they have significant risk factors, then they should be placed on probably prophylactic anticoagulation. The most important of those risk factors would be elevated BMI, cardiac failure, pulmonary insufficiency, venous insufficiency of the legs with venous stasis, and or even lymphedema. And so these are all very important risk factors. And the idea is not to neglect the patients who are at home and quarantined. And I would like to say a further point about this quarantine. Quarantine actually kills people and hurts them. Now, the reason for that is that we have all been scared by the media and to have their blood test should be therapy, stop going certain situations they need semi-elective colonoscopy and so forth. So it's very dangerous for this to happen to these patients.
Un poquito resumiendo, la respuesta del doctor fue que todos los pacientes, bueno, todas las personas que han estado durante la cuarentena, lo más importante en este momento es también ser estratificados, ver qué factores de riesgo se tienen, si es que la persona tiene obesidad, sedentarismo y todo eso. Hay que tratar de eliminar los factores de riesgo que sean modificables. Y la manera mejor de poder disminuir estos factores de riesgo es a través de la actividad física. Y además, pues se podría usar medias de compresión durante las mañanas y las tardes que pues, pueden ayudar a disminuir este riesgo. Sin embargo, en el caso particular donde hayan pacientes que sean COVID positivo, por algún miembro de la casa sea COVID positivo, pero nosotros estamos expuestos y todo eso, y si tenemos factores de riesgo que son pesados, como ya se mencionó, alguna enfermedad cardíaca de base, hipertensión, obesidad, alguna enfermedad venosa, sería importante también que se pueda entrar en el tema de la tromboprofilaxis. No sé si Gabo, por la siguiente pregunta.
Listo, tenemos otra pregunta que nos habían hecho también. Hay pacientes que tienen alto riesgo de sangrado. Si es que hay alguna recomendación en general para este tipo de pacientes para prevención de trombosis en términos de dosis y de medicación. Dr. Caprini, in high-risk bleeding patients, which will be your recommendations about thromboprophylaxis in terms of doses or any particular drug?
That is a very important question. And we know that patients with COVID-19 generally are not at high risk for bleeding. They tend to clot. Nevertheless, that being said, there are patients that have renal insufficiency, where there is an increased risk of bleeding, or they have already been, have pulmonary changes. And you know, in this disease, pulmonary thrombosis and pulmonary hemorrhage are both common. And in these cases, and in any cases where you suspect that the patient's at high risk, or you're unsure about the dose and you increase the dose because, let's say, the D-dimer goes very high, so you follow it with a higher and higher dose of anticoagulation. I strongly recommend everybody to use intravenous heparin drips, standard unfractionated heparin drips. And the value of this is that in the patient that's at high risk of bleeding, if there's any signs of any problem, you just turn off the IV. And I think that's a very important situation. And especially if you look at patients, take a patient who is in ICU, they're on a respirator, they have a D-dimer that's 5 or 6 times normal, and they start to have increased a decreased ability to keep up their oxygen saturation goes down, and it's harder and harder to maintain their oxygenation. And also, let's say they develop tachycardia. this is a typical scenario where you're not going to do a test, but you're probably going to consider full dose anticoagulation in this patient. And if you do that, that's especially where I would use the unfractionated heparin drip, because remember that if you give subcutaneous shots and the patient has any hemodynamic instability, that the absorption of that drug may be irregular. There's nothing irregular about a heparin drip. You know how to handle it. You know what to expect. I know it means some increase in exposure for the nurses, but that's a small price to pay. I believe they just have to be very careful. In addition, when possible, I would prefer that you use the factor 10A inhibitor assay to measure the heparin and not the partial thromboplastin time, because partial thromboplastin time can be inaccurate in these circumstances.
Okay, la respuesta del doctor fue que en función de los pacientes que tienen alto riesgo de sangrado, tenemos que tomar en cuenta dos particularidades. La primera, que la enfermedad es protrombótica, es decir, el paciente de todas formas en algún punto va a necesitar anticoagulación. Pero el otro punto también es que este tipo de pacientes producen hemorragia, sobre todo a nivel pulmonar. Por eso lo que el doctor recomienda, que es de los pacientes que estén graves, que estén en la terapia intensiva, la mejor manera de manejar la anticoagulación en función de un mayor riesgo de sangrado es a través de la bomba de heparina, una infusión de heparina que nos va a ayudar a controlar. ¿Y de qué manera vamos a lograr controlar la infusión de heparina? Él nos menciona que obviamente el control con TTP, a pesar de que esto se considera un factor de riesgo de exposición, tanto para el personal médico como para la enfermera, él considera que también se puede utilizar el factor 10 para poder estudiar cómo va evolucionando el tema de la anticoagulación, porque muchas veces el TTP se ve alterado al momento de esta enfermedad. No sé, Gabo, la siguiente pregunta.
Una de las preguntas que más nos están realizando es justamente, teniendo en cuenta la exposición del doctor, toda la cascada inflamatoria continua que produce el COVID y todos los efectos protrombóticos que estamos teniendo hoy en día debido a esta patología. Ya mencionamos acerca de cuántos puntos tienen que subir en la escala con un COVID positivo sintomático y con otro no sintomático. En todo caso, Dr. Caprini, do you think COVID-19 in acute phase will change actual Caprini score interpretation?
Yes, let me share my screen again.
Entonces, estamos hablando de que básicamente la interpretación del score de Caprini va a depender mucho justamente de la condición en la que se encuentra el paciente. Entonces, ahorita nos va a explicar. So, go ahead, doctor, and keep us explaining.
Yes, so in the coronavirus patient that's positive but asymptomatic, then I would add 2 points to their score. If the patient is virus positive and symptomatic, then score them as a 3. And if they also have a positive D-dimer, then I would score them as a 5. These scores, especially the score of 2 in the asymptomatic patient, that would apply to the outpatients as well, because an outpatient may have other risk factors, and adding this level of risk may increase them and increase their chance of getting a thrombosis. And under those circumstances, those patients probably should be on anticoagulation, at least a prophylactic dose of one of the new oral anticoagulants. We don't recommend Coumadin in these circumstances. It's too hard to keep track of and requires too many tests. A lot of outpatients that are asymptomatic would not be willing to take heparin injections, but a novel oral anticoagulant, rivaroxaban, apixaban, dabigatran, and so forth, in a prophylactic dose would be a good choice. And then let us come back to question number 1 about the immobile patient. And if this is an immobile patient who then is found to have the COVID-19 positive virus, but still remains asymptomatic, then this would add to the score and probably dictate them using prophylaxis.
Ok, bueno, lo que nos menciona el doctor aquí es que por ejemplo, los pacientes que sean asintomáticos y COVID positivo tendrán una sumatoria de más 2 puntos, los que sean COVID y sean sintomáticos van a tener una sumatoria de 3, mientras que los que sean COVID positivo y tengan el dímero D elevado van a tener una puntuación extra de 5 puntos. Y que a pesar de que un paciente sea asintomático y esté en casa, es un paciente que igual debe tener o puede tener factores de riesgo, los mismos que son considerados para el uso de una tromboprofilaxis. Una tromboprofilaxis que se debe realizar con heparinas de bajo peso molecular o con anticoagulantes orales directos. Sin embargo, él no recomienda el uso de los inhibidores de la vitamina K en cuanto al tema del difícil control y manejo y una supervisión. ¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta?
Tenemos una pregunta, nos hace el doctor Ruiz. Dice, ¿cuál anticoagulante directo se puede usar en pacientes manejados de forma ambulatoria? Dr. Caprini, what anticoagulant, direct anticoagulant, it's better for patients, outpatients?
So there's, among the new oral anticoagulants, they're relatively equivalent, but there's certain considerations. First of all, in your country, which ones are available and what are the costs, and also patient preference. You know, how many of us who take care of patients all the time, we say take 2 pills in the morning, 2 pills in the middle of the day, and 2 at the end. And they come in a week later and they say, my symptoms aren't any better. Well, did you take the 2? No, we didn't. I didn't think I needed 2, so I just took 1, or I didn't take any. So depending on the patient, maybe giving them rivaroxaban, which is a once-a-day dose, would be better than patients getting a twice-a-day dose. So it has to be individualized with the patient. But I wouldn't make any distinction, certainly not between rivaroxaban and apixaban. And if you're familiar with using dabigatran, if you can get betrixaban, which is very expensive in the United States, so that it's not, the most important thing is to be on a prophylactic dose. I think there's most data is with apixaban twice a day or rivaroxaban once a day.
Respondiendo a la pregunta, dentro de los anticoagulantes orales directos que se pueden utilizar como tromboprofilaxis, el doctor no hace mención específica en algunos, a pesar de que el apixaban y el rivaroxaban tienen un poco más de evidencia. Sin embargo, todo se debe dirigir hacia el tema del costo y hacia el tema del tipo de adherencia del paciente. Ustedes saben, muchas veces los pacientes no les gusta tomar 2 veces al día la medicación o 1 vez al día, que sería lo mejor. Dentro de este tema, entonces, la conclusión es de que no existe ningún anticoagulante oral directo que sea mejor que el otro en tema de la tromboprofilaxis. So, doctor, I have a question. 2 weeks ago, I was reading the new Mount Sinai protocol, which includes apixaban as a prophylactic and for treatment. But after that, I was reading an article from Italy, which it says that direct anticoagulants work in the same way as the antiretrovirals in the liver metabolism with the cytochrome P450. So what happened with that? Should we change doses or what's going on?
Okay, that's a very important question. So first of all, the question that was asked are in outpatients that may be at increased risk. What anticoagulant do I recommend? Those patients wouldn't be on an antiviral medication, number 1. Number 2, there are certain interactions between the new oral anticoagulants and certain drugs, not only the antiviral drugs, but also some other drugs. And that wouldn't be any different from any patient that's whether or not they have coronavirus. Now, once they get into the hospital, we do not recommend any DOACs, whatever, because we do not have a pedigree with those. Our pedigree is with heparin and low molecular weight heparin. And don't forget the DOACs are either 5 sugars or 3 sugars in the case of dabigatran. Low molecular weight heparin is 19 or 20 sugars, and unfractionated heparin is 50 sugars. And there are some beneficial effects in the unfractionated heparin especially that are very good for inpatients. So for the inpatient phase, it's heparin or low molecular weight heparin. Then once the patients go home, then if they're not still on an antiviral medication or any confounding medications, then they can be put on a DOAC. But the post-discharge phase, it's more arbitrary and it depends on the individual. If I had the disease and I survived it, and I was lucky enough to go home and I still had an elevated Caprini score or a positive D-dimer, I would take low molecular weight heparin every day. But that's just me. So you have to adjust it according to the circumstances.
Un poco respondiendo a la pregunta, yo le había preguntado al doctor que en mucha literatura, especialmente en el nuevo protocolo que salió en el mes de abril del Hospital de Monte Sinaí en los Estados Unidos, mencionan y le adhieren a la Pixaban como parte del manejo integral del paciente con COVID, sea como para tratamiento y profilaxis. Sin embargo, mi pregunta fue que a la par, yo estaba leyendo sobre este tipo de medicación en estudios italianos, y ellos mencionan que hay muchas interacciones porque participan en el mismo metabolismo hepático a través del citocromo P450, lo cual puede alterar la medicación. En función de eso, el doctor me ha sabido contestar de que todos los pacientes durante su hospitalización es aconsejable manejar heparina sódica o heparina de bajo peso molecular, precisamente para evitar este tipo de interferencias, bien sea con los antirretrovirales o con cualquier otro tipo de medicación. Sin embargo, él sí aconseja que al alta el paciente debe ir con al menos un anticoagulante oral y aparte de eso la heparina de bajo peso molecular. No sé, Gabo, ¿alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, Luis Fernando Gortaire nos hace una pregunta. En paciente ambulatorio con indicación de alta, la anticoagulación se mantiene por 15 días. O hasta parámetros de laboratorio, dímero D, ferritina, IL6, PCR, y luego regresan a niveles basales. ¿Cuál sería su recomendación? Dr. Caprini, there are some guidelines that we have read, and probably most of the Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasia, that said that a patient in discharge have to have 15 days of anticoagulants after discharge. What will be your recommendation about this? Because probably it will change when we can see the considerations in prophylaxis and treatment in COVID-19 in the America Venous Forum.
I'm not sure why they came up with 15 days. Because let's take a look at the literature that we know in medical patients without COVID-19. We know, as much as I love the Caprini score, the best post-discharge data in medical patients is the IMPROVE plus D-dimer score. And either rivaroxaban or betrixaban for 35 days has been shown to cut the incidence of venous thromboembolism by 1/3. Very powerful data. Now, that having been said, I have no idea in the world why any guideline committee that knows the literature would ignore the medical literature, in this case, not mine. In this case, the beautiful work of Alex Spiropoulos. And if that's true for medical patients, these are medical patients that are at even higher risk, because many of them have positive D-dimers, many of them have decreased mobility, many of them have diabetes requiring insulin, and these patients need at least what is recommended in the non-COVID patients, at least over a month of prophylaxis. And then at that time, if I were writing the guidelines, why would you not say that if those risk factors that are persistent continue, one would recommend that we continue the prophylaxis? But these people are also data-driven, that they will say, I'm sorry, there's no data. Well, in the absence of data, how do you take care of your patients? And that's something for everybody to remember. The guidelines do not represent the standard of care. The guidelines, I have a very important discussion on what constitutes the risk assessment for an individual patient. And it consists of 4 parts. The first part are guidelines. Now we know in the guidelines that they are usually based on randomized trials that have a control group. And we know that it's not ethical to put high-risk patients in the control group. So right away, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out that those guidelines are for average risk patients. High-risk patients, you have to give them more prophylaxis. And so that's one pitfall. That's one reason why the guidelines are not the standard of care. They may be the standard of care for the average risk patient that fits perfectly into your patient, which we know that almost never happens. Now, the other thing you have to look at is subsequent data since the guidelines were written. And since the guidelines were written the last time in 2012, we know, and that's why we updated the Caprini score, sleep apnea, a BMI of over 40, even blood transfusions, smoking, HIV. These are all risk factors. So what do? You walk up to the patient with one of these risk factors and you say, well, I can't, you're right on the border for using prophylaxis. Now, if I use some of these newer risk factors that haven't been validated, then I'm not following the literature, but I'll be taking care of you as a patient. So that's the second thing. Now, the third thing is Riete. And Riete is the most powerful database. God bless Monreal and Emmanuel Monreal and his associates. It's over 200 hospitals with now 90,000 patients and over 110 peer-reviewed publications telling us what doctors do all over the world with their patients with DVT. It's not guidelines, it's what actually happened. It's actually what the doctors got to do. So now you have to look at Riete and see if your patient might fit in Riete, consider Riete. Then the next thing you have to do is the score. Now we have 40 elements in the score, and the Caprini score is one of the few scores that has family history of thrombosis, obstetrical misadventures in it. And it's fine to use the simpler scores, but do you realize that every time that you use Padua or Improve and you don't track family history, if that patient has family history, that greatly escalates their risk. Now, I'm not telling everybody that they can't use them. I'm just saying the pitfalls. So, and then the other thing is it's taken my own home hospital years. They're just getting to using the Caprini score now. And so every hospital is different, and it takes a long time to teach everybody the scores. And that's one of the reasons that the American Venous Forum still recommended the Caprini score for post-discharge and not the Improve score. It wasn't that the Improve score data is very, very good. And if your hospital is using Improve, by all means, use that score. But to try to take your hospital, which has one score, let's say the Caprini score, and teach another score, it becomes too confusing. If you come in as a medical patient and they score you with Padua or Improve, and now you go to surgery and you need to be scored with a Caprini score, that creates confusion. You can't do that. But finally, there's another element in the risk assessment process for an individual patient. And I will use this example. Let us say that if you look at the latest ASH guidelines for thrombosis prophylaxis in the surgical patient, they, to me, have very little bearing on teaching us how to take care of our patients. For example, we do not recommend routine prophylaxis after laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So you're looking at the guidelines and you have a patient like that, and you haven't done the 40 elements of the Caprini score, which, by the way, and then in the 50 pages of the guidelines, I mentioned the Caprini score in one article. So you don't give that patient prophylaxis. Patient dies. Now you have another patient, equivalent patient, and you decide that wasn't a very good outcome. So despite the fact that what the guidelines tell us, I'm going to try a different approach so that maybe I get a better outcome and this patient doesn't die. That's called clinical judgment and experience. So this is a complex process, but don't forget, taking care of human beings is a complex process. And I am very, very adamant about trying not to simplify the process, because when you simplify the process, you treat that patient more of as a stranger than as a friend.
Okay. So, en cuanto a la pregunta que realizó el doctor Gortaire, nos mencionó cuál es el tiempo aconsejable de continuar con la anticoagulación al momento del alta. De acuerdo a las guías del foro venoso, menciona que eran por 15 días. La respuesta del doctor Caprini dice que realmente estos 15 días, realmente él no entiende por qué ellos han puesto esos 15 días, tomando en cuenta que existe un background, una historia o una evidencia previa antes de la era COVID, donde los pacientes clínicos tenían que recibir al menos por un mes. Los pacientes que recibían por al menos un mes este tipo de tratamiento, su riesgo de desarrollar un evento tromboembólico disminuía en al menos un 30%. Es por eso que es necesario continuar con esto. Sin embargo, hay que tener mucho cuidado al momento de interpretar una guía, porque las guías al final de cuentas son recomendaciones. Se realizan tanto en pacientes, por decir el prototipo, el paciente que tiene unos determinados factores de riesgo, pero sin embargo a cada paciente hay que individualizar, valorar los factores de riesgo y para tomar una decisión de esta manera. Es importante además mencionar que para la continuación o no del tratamiento se puede utilizar el dímero D y otra vez una de las escalas que se había mencionado. Y el doctor Caprini menciona la importancia del score de Caprini debido a que este score involucra los antecedentes patológicos personales, historias previas de la familia, del tromboembolismo y todo eso, que de cierto modo le dan un poder mayor, una significancia más importante al desarrollo del tromboembolismo. Entonces, si bien es cierto, todas las escalas sirven, tienen evidencia, la escala de Caprini es un poco más completa y nos puede ayudar en ese tema. ¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta?
Tenemos otra pregunta que nos hace Santiago Celi. Dice, la evidencia recomienda heparina de bajo peso molecular en pacientes COVID moderados severos hospitalizados. ¿Cuál es la opinión del doctor sobre el uso de heparina de bajo peso molecular en pacientes ambulatorios? Doctor Caprini, what's your opinion about low molecular heparin in outpatients?
That's a very good idea. Could you elaborate on does that mean when the patients with COVID-19 go home, should they be, what is my opinion on using low molecular weight heparin?
Yeah, the patient which is at home, that is not hospitalized.
Yeah, so my preference is low molecular weight heparin, no question. Now, will the patient be willing to inject themselves? That may be a problem. For me, it's not a problem. And so I would much prefer to use low molecular weight heparin because of the advantages of the heparin-like compounds. And the new oral anticoagulants don't have those properties necessarily. It's strictly clotting. And also there are some confounding things. If you were taking some over-the-counter products, that health products and so forth, and you're taking an oral anticoagulant, then that might confound the issue. And don't forget, there's something very important here that's not often talked about. It's sort of something that you keep hidden to the side. In 2012, the International Society of Hemostasis and Thrombosis subcommittee on new anticoagulants published a paper in the Journal of Thrombosis and Hemostasis listing the 9 guidelines, the 9 reasons why the DOACs need to be monitored. Emergency surgery, recurrent DVT, and you're not sure if the patient took the drug. Now, the new drugs are so good and they've been shown to be so safe that we often forget about those 9 indications for doing testing. And we don't have good testing unless you have dabigatran. Dabigatran has the dilute thrombin time is a very good test. And 10A assays keyed to rivaroxaban and apixaban aren't quite as good. But that's why sticking with the low molecular weight heparin in a serious disease like this is the safest course of action, because you can do a 10A assay for heparin and find out what's going on and increase the dose. Or if the patient has a complication, you understand it more because you're more used, everybody's used to taking care of low molecular weight heparin patients. So in general, I would stay away from the new oral anticoagulants after discharge. However, the patients have to be willing to give shots. They have to be willing to buy the medicine, what is available, and what they will do. It's nice to talk about it, but if they don't, like that patient that I said, take 2 pills in the morning and 2 pills at 2 o'clock, if they're not going to do that, then maybe you give them a pill they take once a day, because at least they'll take that. So it's a complicated issue, and you have to go patient by patient. It's impossible to generalize.
En cuanto a la respuesta de la pregunta, ese quedaría con la heparina de bajo peso molecular, sería su droga de elección. Sin embargo, hay que tomar en cuenta si es que el paciente, la adherencia al tratamiento, si es que él va a dejarse inyectar todos los días, si es que él va a permitir esa condición con la que va a vivir. Aparte de eso, es importante manejar con heparina de bajo peso molecular porque es una droga conocida, nosotros conocemos los efectos adversos y es más fácil medirla y poder tratar de sus complicaciones. Sin embargo, no se puede descartar totalmente el uso de los nuevos anticoagulantes orales, que también son una herramienta importante al momento de poder realizar este tipo de tratamiento en los pacientes. Sin embargo, ellos tienen cierto tipo de complicaciones, como es la toma diaria, la toma 2 veces al día, la interacción que existe con otros medicamentos. Entonces, él se quedaría con la heparina de bajo peso molecular, pero no descartaría los nuevos anticoagulantes orales, que en evidencia no tienen ningún nivel de interioridad.
Doctor, tenemos una última pregunta. El aumento rápido del dímero D durante la hospitalización de pacientes que se encuentran con tromboprofilaxis, ¿sería una indicación para pasar de la tromboprofilaxis a la anticoagulación en pacientes estables? Dr. Caprini, the rapid increase in D-dimer during hospitalization of patients who find themselves with thromboprophylaxis, will it be an indication for anticoagulation in stable patients?
So I didn't quite understand a couple of those words.
What Cesar says is that if we have a stable patient and after some days they become more ill and the D-dimer elevates, the patient will switch from thromboprophylaxis to anticoagulation.
Oh yeah, so I understand. So if I may restate that, as a patient comes in, is stable, and then begins to have an increase or an escalation of their disease, maybe they have to go to ICU, or maybe they're in ICU, but now they need the respirator, or maybe they're not in ICU, but their D-dimer all of a sudden goes up to 4 or 5 times normal. So now you put them in ICU, and in those patients, until we have data that tells us that we're doing the wrong thing, many investigators around the world taking care of patients continue to escalate the dose of heparin or low molecular weight heparin in the hopes of saving the patients. Now, we know so far that except for select groups that have disseminated intravascular coagulation-like syndrome, that the death rate isn't altered by increasing the heparin. But nevertheless, we still are going to increase the heparin. What needs to be done, I think, and this hasn't been tried yet, but maybe it's being tried in trials, is starting to add other agents to, in other words, in that patient that you decide you've got to give a full dose of anticoagulation, then I would go ahead and maybe start something else. Maybe start one of the antiviral drugs. Maybe start an antiplatelet drug. Maybe even, God forbid, some corticosteroids, but some other, we're going to need a cocktail in these patients like you described that are all of a sudden getting worse. No one drug or no one approach is going to be the answer. and I think it will be a cocktail. And if you decide to use a cocktail, then by all means, the heparin choice ought to be intravenous drip unfractionated heparin, because the cocktail was going to complicate the picture. And we mustn't forget about the fact that although there isn't a lot of bleeding been reported, that pulmonary hemorrhages have been seen as a part of the disease, because the virus preferentially attacks the alveolar endothelial lining of the lungs.
Entonces, un poco contestando la pregunta que fue que en cuanto a si un paciente está con tromboprofilaxis, empeora clínicamente, su dímero D se eleva, ¿qué pasaría si es que pasaría anticoagulación? La respuesta es definitivamente que sí, pasaría anticoagulación, sobre todo con heparinas de bajo peso molecular o considerando el uso de una infusión de heparina sódica. Y la importancia es de aquí que los pacientes, a medida que van deteriorando, van a necesitar otro tipo de medicamentos que recién ahorita se están probando, como sería añadir tanto más antirretrovirales, el mismo de antiplaquetarios o el uso de corticoides. Entonces, eso es lo que todavía se está demostrando. Sin embargo, es súper mandatorio el uso de las heparinas, cualquiera de estas los que sean, para el manejo de los pacientes que se consideran con casos clínicos severos, tomando en cuenta siempre la posibilidad de una hemorragia que puede existir sobre todo a nivel alveolar, que es lo que nos menciona el doctor. So, doctor, I have another question. So, which score do you recommend for grading bleeding risk? You know, we have many bleeding risk scores, but sometimes we don't know what to use or what parameters in the labs could we use to see how it's going, what is going on the patient.
Well, I've never been happy with any of the bleeding scores. And for example, one of the scores that says if the patient is over 65 and has bled in the past, that then it increases their risk of bleeding. And we know from Riete that if a patient comes in with a hemorrhage in the brain and more than 2 weeks elapse and they develop a clot and need to get anticoagulation, their risk of death from bleeding, if they get anticoagulation, is no greater than the patient who never bled. So as you get out a few weeks beyond, then the risk of bleeding goes down. And so we don't have, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think that we have to take it case by case. And when we have patients who are at increased risk of bleeding, the first instinct shouldn't be to go to a score, but should be to go to intravenous heparin drip.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget about mechanical compression, pneumatic compression.
Sí, la pregunta que yo le realicé es, dentro de todo el abanico que tenemos de score de sangrado para determinar el riesgo de sangrado de los pacientes, ¿cuál es el que nos recomendaría? Y dice, la verdad, todos los scores que se pueden utilizar son buenos, pero realmente hay que estratificar al paciente y ver cada una de las cosas que él tiene, por ejemplo, los antecedentes y todo eso. Sin embargo, sería importante que el uso de las medias de compresión y el uso de la heparina sódica, que esa es la que se puede controlar de una mejor manera.
I would like to make an additional comment.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that is not paid much attention to would be a patient that has surgery and the next day drops their hemoglobin or shows some sign of bleeding. So they hold the anticoagulation and say, oh, the bleeding risk is too high. Then I think it's important to reevaluate that patient on a very frequent basis, more often than day, hour by hour almost. When does the bleeding risk go back down? And so as soon as the bleeding risk improves, so now we go 2 or 3 days, the patient hasn't bled anymore, the patient is stable, they're not at high risk of bleeding anymore. But if you use the bleeding score, one of the popular bleeding scores would say if the patient bled, then they're at high risk. So that's why I would say that even more important than identifying patients who are at high risk of bleeding is to make sure that when that risk comes down, that you reintroduce the anticoagulation.
Mm-hmm. So, el doctor nos acaba de mencionar un punto importante, sobre todo pacientes que han sido sometidos a cirugía o cualquier tipo de paciente que, por ejemplo, tengan la hemoglobina baja y esto constituya un factor de riesgo importante de sangrado. Obviamente hay que detener la anticoagulación, pero lo más importante es no detener la anticoagulación, sino su reinicio precoz de la manera más oportuna para evitar cualquier tipo de evento tromboembólico. Sí. Gabo, ¿qué?
Bueno, nosotros queremos compartir una pequeña diapositiva con usted, doctor. Dr. Caprini, thank you very much for being here in Ecuador from our homes. Thanks for accepting this meeting, this invitation. For us was really a pleasure having you here, and we will be delighted to having you here in Ecuador. So thank you very much, Dr. Caprini.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great honor and a privilege, and I've enjoyed this tremendously, interacting with all of my friends, and I hope someday we can do it in person. Thank you very much, and everybody stay safe.
Muchas gracias a todos los presentes. Para Varices Ecuador ha sido un verdadero privilegio tener a tan exponente expositor dentro y amigo de nosotros. Estamos agradecidos con Daniel, agradecidos con Gabriel, agradecidos con toda la organización que hemos tenido. Doctor Caprini, muchas gracias. Usted es bienvenido acá en Ecuador. Lo esperamos con los brazos abiertos. Siempre estamos presentes y estudiando sus aportaciones tan importantes que nos ha dado al mundo de la cirugía vascular. Como médico, como cirujano vascular y como persona, le agradezco enormemente y nos hemos nutrido de una forma impresionante de su conocimiento. Muchas gracias a la gente que nos ha acompañado y a la gente que ha hecho sus preguntas.
Thank you very much.